What principle was established by the European Court of Justice, ECJ, in the Van Genden Loos case, 1963, and how does it affect the relationship between EU law and national laws of member states? A. The principle of supremacy, establishing that EU law takes precedence over conflicting national law. B. The principle of direct effect, allowing individuals to invoke EU law directly in national courts. C. The principle of proportionality, ensuring that EU measures are necessary and appropriate to achieve their objectives. D. The principle of mutual recognition, facilitating the free movement of goods by recognizing standards and regulations of other member states. Correct answer, B. Explanation. The Van Genden Loos case established the principle of direct effect, a foundational concept in EU law. This principle allows individuals and companies to directly invoke provisions of EU law in national courts, provided those provisions are clear, unconditional, and do not require further action by EU or national authorities. This case significantly impacted the relationship between EU law and the national laws of member states by empowering individuals to ensure the enforcement of EU law at the national level, enhancing the effectiveness and reach of EU legislation. In the Costa versus Enel case, 1964, what key principle regarding the nature of the European Union legal order was established by the European Court of Justice? A. The principle of subsidiarity, restricting the EU's actions to only those necessary to achieve its objectives. B. The principle of direct applicability, stipulating that EU regulations apply automatically and uniformly across all member states. C. The principle of supremacy, asserting that EU law has primacy over conflicting national laws. D. The principle of conferral, limiting the EU's competences to those expressly granted by the treaties. Correct answer, C. Explanation. The Costa versus Enel case cemented the principle of supremacy, or primacy, of EU law, declaring that EU law takes precedence over conflicting national laws. This landmark ruling by the ECJ established a fundamental principle of the EU legal order, ensuring the uniform application and effectiveness of EU law across all member states. The supremacy of EU law is a crucial mechanism for maintaining the coherence and integrity of the EU legal system, enabling it to function as a unified legal entity distinct from the sum of its member states' national legal systems. How does the principle of conferral operate within the EU legal framework, and what is its significance in delineating the powers between the EU and its member states? A. It mandates that all powers not explicitly conferred to the EU by the treaties remain with the member states, serving as a foundational principle that limits the scope of EU action. B. It provides the EU with implicit powers to act in areas beyond those explicitly conferred by the treaties, expanding the EU's ability to legislate in new policy areas. C. It requires member states to confer additional powers to the EU through unanimous agreement in the European Council, facilitating the dynamic expansion of EU competences. D. It establishes a system of checks and balances whereby the European Parliament can confer powers on the European Commission beyond those granted by the treaties. Correct answer, A. Explanation. The principle of conferral is a cornerstone of the EU legal framework, stipulating that the EU can only act within the limits of the competences expressly conferred upon it by the treaties. This principle delineates the division of powers between the EU and its member states, ensuring that the EU does not overstep its designated role. The significance of this principle lies in its function as a safeguard against the over-centralization of power, preserving member states' sovereignty by limiting EU action to those areas where member states have specifically agreed to act collectively through the treaties. What was the significance of the Cassis de Dijon case, 1979, in shaping the EU's internal market? A. It established the principle that member states cannot restrict imports from other member states unless such restrictions are justified by imperative requirements. B. It introduced the concept of European citizenship, granting EU citizens the right to move and reside freely within the territory of the member states. C. It ruled that VAT rates within the EU must be harmonized to ensure the free movement of goods. D. It delineated the exclusive competences of the EU, limiting member states' ability to legislate in areas such as environmental protection and consumer rights. Correct answer, A. Explanation. The Cassis de Dijon case was a landmark ruling by the European Court of Justice that had a profound impact on the development of the EU's internal market. It established the principle of mutual recognition, stating that a product legally produced and marketed in one member state must, in principle, be allowed to be sold in any other member state. This case significantly contributed to the removal of trade barriers within the EU, promoting the free movement of goods by limiting the ability of member states to impose unjustified restrictions on imports from other member states under the guise of product standards and regulations. In EU law, how does the doctrine of implied powers extend the competences of the European Union beyond those explicitly stated in the treaties? A. By allowing the European Parliament to grant new competences to the European Commission through ordinary legislative procedures. B. Through the ECJ's interpretation that the EU has the authority to act in areas not explicitly conferred by the treaties if such action is necessary to achieve the objectives of the conferred competences. C. By enabling member states to transfer additional powers to the EU through unanimous agreement in the European Council without formal treaty amendments. D. It allows the EU to exercise competences in areas of national sovereignty if deemed necessary by a qualified majority of member states for the functioning of the internal market. Correct answer, B. Explanation. The doctrine of implied powers in EU law is based on the European Court of Justice's interpretations, which hold that the EU possesses the authority to act in areas not explicitly conferred upon it by the treaties, provided such actions are necessary to achieve the objectives of the competences that have been expressly granted. This doctrine allows the EU to adapt to new challenges and objectives within the scope of its existing competences, ensuring the effectiveness and coherence of its policies and actions. It underscores the dynamic nature of EU law, enabling the EU's legal and institutional framework to evolve in response to practical necessities and the overarching goals of the Union. What landmark ruling established the doctrine of direct effect for directives, and what are its conditions? A. The Frankovich case, which stated that directives could have direct effect if they're clear, precise, and unconditional, and the deadline for transposition has passed without proper implementation by the member state. B. The Van Dun case, establishing that directives can directly confer rights on individuals which national courts must protect, provided the directives are sufficiently clear, precise, and unconditional. C. The Factortame case, ruling that directives can have direct effect against member states, including provisions that are horizontally directly effective. D. The Simmenthal case, asserting that all national laws conflicting with EU law, including directives, must be set aside to allow for their direct effect in national courts. Correct answer. B. Explanation. The Van Dun case established the doctrine that directives can have direct effect, allowing individuals to invoke them in national courts. This landmark ruling clarified that for a directive to have direct effect, it must be sufficiently clear, precise, and unconditional. While the doctrine primarily applies to the obligations of member states, vertical direct effect, its application has been nuanced in subsequent jurisprudence regarding horizontal direct effect between individuals. The Van Dun case significantly empowered individuals within the EU, enabling them to rely on unimplemented or improperly implemented directives in national courts, thus reinforcing the effectiveness of EU law at the national level. Exploring the principle of state liability in EU law, what are the criteria established by the European Court of Justice for holding a member state liable for damages caused to individuals by breaches of EU law? A. The breach must be of a directive that has direct effect, the breach must be sufficiently serious, and there must be a direct causal link between the breach and the damage suffered. B. The member state must have failed to transpose an EU directive, the directive must confer rights on individuals, and the content of those rights must be identifiable based on the provisions of the directive. C. The state's action or inaction must constitute a manifest and grave disregard for the limits on its discretion, the breach must violate a treaty, and the treaty provision violated must be intended to confer rights on individuals. D. The breach must involve an area of exclusive competence of the EU, there must be intent or negligence on the part of the state, and the individual must prove that less damage would have occurred in the absence of the breach. Correct answer. A. Explanation. The European Court of Justice established the principle of state liability for breaches of EU law with specific criteria in the Frankovich and subsequent cases. A member state can be held liable for damages caused to individuals by its failure to comply with EU law if the rule of law infringed is intended to confer rights on individuals, the breach is sufficiently serious, and there is a direct causal link between the breach and the damage suffered. This principle reinforces the effectiveness of EU law by ensuring that individuals have recourse to compensation when their rights under EU law are violated due to a member state's action or inaction, emphasizing member states' obligation to uphold EU law.